fellow Canada and hockey fans in the United States and Newfoundland.
The final results of the election will be in doubt for, well, in several seats for probably a number of days.
We lost the government, and frankly, it was my fault.
And what is before us is cultural dispossession, unless we're prepared to do something about it.
For the first time in our history, parents believe that the future of their children will be less promising than their own.
We would therefore establish as an essential part of that program a guaranteed annual income for all those Canadians who cannot earn for themselves and who live today below the poverty line.
Ralph Klein told a group of newcomers he wants what he called bums and creeps from Eastern Canada to stay home.
And to feel like, as much as is possible in this kind of world, the master in his own house.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Red Ensign Special. This is Elbows Down. All right, so over the course of this week, we had what I would call a very propaganda-intensive event. That is the settlement between the government of Canada and the government of the U.S. of the financial arrangements around the Gordie Howe International Bridge it's in the Detroit-Windsor area. We have, in this screenshot, both sides of the propaganda war represented. We have Table Salt here representing Team Canadian Slop, saying Canada to hand over 50% of toll revenue on the Gordie Howe Bridge after paying for 100% of the bridge's construction costs. And you have Donald Trump bragging about the much better deal that he got. Now, the thing that these two sides can agree on is that the financial arrangement that the Trump administration extracted out of the Carney administration is more favorable to the United States. And both of them actually are trying to represent it as kind of an arrangement which unfairly benefits the United States. Almost nothing about the narratives presented in this set of screenshots is actually true. And in the interests of value-free analysis, we're going to go through this deal in some detail to look at the previous and the current arrangement and what it says about the bilateral relationship between Canada and the United States. But it's first worth reflecting on the implication of this concession by the Carney government. This is the first time that the Carney government, since coming to power, has given the Trump administration a propaganda win in exchange for a material concession. The Gordie Howe International Bridge was complete and not in operation, harming both sides, but particularly harming the government of Canada, which very aggressively wanted the bridge constructed. What the Carney administration did was surrender a propaganda win, surrender a news cycle to Table Salt et al. In exchange for a material advance of the position that they want to do, that the Carney government would, the position the Carney government is representing on behalf of the Canadian people. This is a change in tenor in what's coming out of the Carney government, and it's worth noting, and it's worth taking the time to modestly encourage. It would probably be good for us as Canadians if the rhetoric here got turned down a little bit on some of this stuff. But let's look at the deal in some detail here. So the original agreement that launched the project for the Gordie Howe International Bridge is a 1,097-page document covering every detail of how the bridge will be financed, constructed, the procurement process, all the way down to who will be responsible for cleaning and garbage pickup. All right. This is typical of procurement for multi-billion-dollar government projects. It is organized critically under in administrative shells that has existed for a very long time, called the Windsor-Detroit Bridge Authority. The Windsor-Detroit Bridge Authority is one of these non-government organizations that has representatives from both the Canadian government, the Canadian federal government, the U.S. federal government, the Michigan and Ontario governments on it, as well as some quote unquote independent people. And they are the ones who actually have administered and paid for the construction of the bridge. And they have put together a helpful fact sheet to reduce down, to pull out the financial details of this 1,097 page document, which covers all kinds of aspects of the operation and construction of the bridge. And the first thing to kind of understand is that it's not correct to say that the Canadian government paid for the bridge. The Canadian government, the Canadian federal government, that is, made a multi-billion-dollar loan to the Windsor-Detroit Bridge Authority in order to make it possible to raise enough funds to construct the bridge. The bridge was budgeted for $2.6 billion. The actual cost was $4.4 billion, of course. The most of that cost was covered by the loan from the government of Canada, but there's almost $1 billion worth of other interested parties who have either debt or equity interest in the bridge. There's some $800 million worth of short, medium, and long-term bonds that were issued to various parties. There's actually equity interest in the bridge that have been given to 3 construction and engineering firms that contributed to the financing of the bridge. Why they did that, I don't know. That seems like a terrible idea, but they did. The arrangement on tolls between the government of Canada and the government of the United States is an arrangement not on the tolls themselves, but an arrangement on the excess of the toll revenue over the obligated payments from the Windsor-Detroit Bridge Authority to the various debt holders, including the government of Canada. That is to say, the government of Canada will get repayment of its loan on original terms ahead of any split in toll revenue. That split in toll revenue, 50% of which will go to the government of Canada directly, and 50% of which will go into some kind of regional development authority, which will use that money in some kind of ill-defined way in order to encourage economic development in the Windsor-Detroit region. It's unclear exactly which side of the border that will be spent on. This looks like a classic political graft kind of arrangement. All right, let's look at some of the details of this deal just before we move on. So we have Aecon Construction and ACS Infrastructure Canada as kind of classic elements of Laurentian elite power in construction and engineering. I don't know very much about Fluor Canada, but I would be surprised if it's much different. Again, Fluor Canada, it's got on the syndicates for the lenders, you can see here Desjardins, TD, Royal Bank of Canada, and then you've got 2 other banks that are participants as well. And so that's how the syndicate was put out. That's how the loan was put together. This is a kind of classic architecture for a Canadian infrastructure project. So that's the actual situation. The government, it's very likely that the bondholders, equity holders, and the government of Canada as the primary lender are going to collect the overwhelming majority of the tolls. The kind of mandate of the Windsor-Detroit Bridge Authority is to set toll rates at levels which produce enough revenue to exceed the debt and equity, the obligations it has to the debt and equity holders, rather than to maximize the revenue potential of the bridge. And so you can kind of see how this is going to go. There's going to be a small excess. That small excess is going to get divided up, but it's fundamentally immaterial to the bridge arrangement. And the fact that the bridge was closed for a month over renegotiating this is a pure propaganda epiphenomena of the democratic process on both sides. First, on the Trump administration side for reorganizing the deal, and on the side of the Canadian government for taking a month in order to surrender 50% of the excess tolls to some like nonsense development agency that's going to spend them in ways politically favored by the Trump administration. And you can see why I'm somewhat positive on the willingness of the Carney administration to let go of the propaganda moment here, knowing that it's going to look like an L to them in the media, in exchange for getting this deal actually done and getting primary toll revenue in, such that the government of Canada gets repaid on its whatever it is $3 billion loan that we made in order to get the project going. Not to mention the bond and equity holders in the actual bridge, many of whom will be agencies associated with the Canadian government in one way, shape, or form. This is a sub-example of a phenomenon that I've been observing in the bilateral relationship for a very long time, and that is the propaganda layer that sits on top of the relationship is, I'm not sure if it's interfering or if it's, so there's two ways to read this. Either you can say the propaganda layer of managing the relationship is interfering with the substantive layer of the relationship. In other words, the Trump administration's need to get a propaganda win in the bilateral relationship, and the Carney administration's need to appear that they're holding elbows up, creates this month-long disruption for no particular purpose. And they're interfering in the kind of detailed technical work of actually managing the bilateral relationship. My view of the situation is a little bit more negative than that. If I look at comparable disputes, so for example, the most complicated trade dispute between Canada and the United States in current day is the trade dispute over softwood lumber. If you've ever looked into the details of what would be a fair rate of tariff, if one exists, between Canada and the US over softwood lumber, you'll quickly discover that all logging is arguably subsidized and all logging is arguably subject to absurd taxes. That is to say that every time you commercially log a piece of property, either in Canada or the United States, typically that property belongs to the federal government. And so that there's one issue. Typically, you're mandated to reforest it in some way, shape, or form. That's another issue. Typically, there's a whole set of infrastructure that makes logging the territory possible. Logging roads, licenses for floating the logs, all that kind of stuff, in which federal, provincial, and municipal governments are heavily involved. And typically, there are very strenuous environmental regulations about exactly how you transport the logs, exactly how you mill the logs, exactly how you replant. All of this stuff radically impacts your baseline costs. And so in order to have free trade across the border, you have to harmonize all of these practices across political and environmental realities that are radically different. And in my view, it's something of a minor miracle that for long stretches between 1983 and 2016, you could freely trade softwood lumber across the Canadian-US border in direct competition. But if you look at the history of this trade relationship, you'll see that the disputes recur, and that each time they recur, they take longer to resolve. So the dispute in 1986 was resolved almost right away. The dispute in 1991 took 3 years to resolve. The dispute in 2001 took 5 years to resolve. The dispute in 2016 is now, I guess, 7 years and counting. And well, I guess it's not 2023 anymore. It's 2026. So it's 10 years and counting. And there's no prospect that it's going to get resolved anytime soon. I don't think that the softwood lumber dispute resolution problem is a political grandstanding problem. I think it's a technical competence problem where a deal cannot be the softwood lumber version of this 1,097 page document that governs the actual administration of a single bridge. I don't think that version of a document covering softwood lumber can actually be constructed in a way that is considered fair by both sides on anything resembling a reasonable time frame in the environment that is both the Canadian and US federal bureaucracies. They're not capable of forming that agreement. And to the extent that they are capable of forming that agreement, they're not capable of forming that agreement on a timescale that is smaller than the changes that occur in the underlying industrial process to come up with a fair relationship between the two countries. In other words, the substructure of government bureaucracy that is required to have tariff-free exchange of a complicated good like this has decayed to the point where it's easier just to have trade barriers and operate the two economies independently. This is a value-free observation, whether you think it's good, bad, or indifferent, to have integration between the Canadian and US economy at this level. And if we can't do it with softwood lumber, then when we look at the current schedule of tariffs between Canada and the US and what they cover, you'll notice that the list keeps growing, and the items that get resolved never quite fall off the bottom, right? There's an increasing list of these non-CUSMA covered products for which there is a trade dispute, for which we cannot seem to reach resolution. And despite rhetoric on both sides, the volume of transactions in tariff-targeted goods, apart from steel, continues to grow. And so despite rhetoric, the United States is not actually onshoring aluminum production. Despite rhetoric, the United States is not bringing auto construction back from Canada into the United States. What you're seeing is a permanent state of dispute being resolved with permanent tariffs rather than a negotiated solution to the endless list of grievances between the two parties. This is an interesting state of affairs, not all that surprising if you look at the competence of the two governments in other areas of their operation. But I think we really need to understand this moment in terms of the level of competence in administration and the level of confidence that exists in the senior levels of government in the bureaucracy that would previously have been responsible for coming up with agreements of this type. All this is not especially hopeful to the future if you're from the kind of Stephen Harper, more deeply integrate the economies of Canada and the United States sort of track. In order to realize that vision, you would need to deal with this competence problem in both the Canadian and the U.S. government, and especially the U.S. government, in my view, as well as address the problem at the level of the political. All this goes away, of course, for the economic nationalists, who are perfectly happy to allow this enormously complicated intergovernmental machinery to decay and to form the first part of the wedge to drive the two economies apart. But these people have to deal with the fact that even in the face of significant tariffs, volume of trade going north-south across the border continues to grow. In other words, the economic nationalist dream on either side of the border is not being realized because the benefits to trade are so much greater than the tariffs which have been imposed so far. Very interesting problem, very interesting situation. I would tend to think that it's probably better for Canada at this phase of the existence of the U.S. empire to have a kind of gradual decoupling driven by tariffs than to reform these kinds of intergovernmental agencies at a more competent level, especially given that I don't really believe in the ability of either party to do so. But that's an editorial position. Most of this video is just dedicated to documenting what has actually gone on here. Thanks for your time and attention. I hope you learned something.
Canada originally was put together by two groups of people who didn't have much in common but didn't want to be American.
The line just popped into my head. A bunch of the boys was a-whooping it up. And there I got my start.
We have had a flag. Flags can be changed. But flags cannot be imposed, the sacred symbols of a people's hopes and aspirations, by the simple, capricious, personal choice of a Prime Minister of Canada.
I have watched this country for half of my life from abroad, and we have turned complacency into just that, a national sport.
I am resolutely opposed to all innovation, all change, but I am determined to understand what's happening. I don't choose just to sit and let the juggernaut roll over me.